I'm thrilled today that we have our first couple interview for the Seekers Forum. In 13 years, we've never actually had a wife and husband team, or in fact, any team, as our guest interview. And I'm so delighted that the Hases could join us. So, just a brief introduction to Devon and Nico. In their upcoming book, This Messy, Gorgeous Love, A Buddhist Guide to Lasting Partnership, Devon and Nico Hase offer practical, funny, profound insights into the challenges of intimacy for people on a spiritual path. The Hases lead meditation retreats throughout North America and Europe, and Devon teaches at numerous centers, including the Insight Meditation Society and Spirit Rock. Nico spent 6 years in a Zen monastery and then completed a PhD in counseling psychology before transitioning into teaching mindfulness, meditation, and Dharma full-time. Their first book, How Not to Be a Hot Mess, A Buddhist Survival Guide for Modern Life, offers 6 essential principles for confronting contemporary challenges with intelligence, humor, and integrity. They live in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm delighted to welcome both of you. Hi, Devon. Hi, Nico.
Hello there. Thank you so much for having us. We're thrilled to be here.
Great to see
very
you.
happy to be here.
Great to see you. So, the first question, it comes from your first book. There was a quote in there that I'd like to apply to our conversation today. You write, mindfulness is not enough to live a level-headed existence in the middle of the storm that is contemporary life. I wonder how that applies to relationships. Is mindfulness enough to live in the middle of the storm that sometimes happens around intimacy and relationships? So I'll throw that out to you, and whichever would like to start, we'll get going.
Thanks, Mark. I'll start us off. I think the answer is mindfulness is a great support to the messiness that we find in our most intimate relationships. But just like mindfulness is not enough to steady yourself in the wider spin of the world, mindfulness alone is probably not enough to steady your heart and engage in the ways that you feel best about in a partnership or with your closest friends or with your family. And what you're going to need in addition to mindfulness, which is an essential ingredient, is probably some principles, some ways of being, some ways of understanding, some deeper wisdom that you can rely on when things get difficult. And this is what essentially both of our books are about.
Mm-hmm. I'll just jump in and add that we really make this point in our first book that mindfulness, when it was taught by the Buddha, always was accompanied by all these other qualities. You know, the Buddha taught clarity and wisdom. He taught ethics. He taught compassion and kindness, all alongside this principle of sati, or mindfulness. And so that's really what we're trying to do is, as mindfulness becomes popular in our culture, in our Western culture, we're wanting to also uphold these other qualities of ethics and kindness, compassion, clarity that always came alongside mindfulness. It was never alone. It was never meant to be alone. And so that's really what we're doing, is bringing in all of these other qualities as well.
That makes perfect sense. So I'd like to ask you a very general question. And what is it that distinguishes using a relationship as a spiritual practice? What's different about having a relationship as a spiritual practice versus just being in the rough and tumble of an emotional connection?
Sure. I can start us off with a story.
Please.
So Nico and I met almost 20 years ago. And when we did, I had just moved to a Tibetan retreat center in the high mountains of Colorado. And he was living as a Zen monk, also in the high mountains of Colorado, about 3 hours drive. And we met by happenstance through a friend. But our first conversation was actually about dating. And we both said, you know, neither of us are really dating material because we're so committed to our path of meditation and our communities that we were living with, respectively. And so really there's this sense for both of us that relationship has always been it's like wasn't going to work if it wasn't going to be part of our path of awakening.
Mm.
And so that's, even when we got married, our commitment, our vows were about being partners in awakening.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as we could continue to do that, to accompany each other on this path of freedom, and for us it's Buddhism, but I think it could be, any spiritual tradition, that as long as our relationship is upholding that commitment, then we're good. And that's, not necessarily true for everyone, but we've been intentional from the beginning, and I think we really needed our partnership to be more than just about romantic love, that it was about our awakening individually, but also I think our service in the world, this sense that from an altruistic perspective, our relationship is about kind of standing side by side but facing the world, and how can we work together in our engagement. And that has always been true, but it seems true now more than ever, I will say.
Anything to add to that, Nico?
Maybe I'll add maybe just like a real question for ourselves, for our listeners. What is your life about? What do you want in life? And if let's say one version of what Buddhism promises or what meditation practice promises is cultivating the beautiful qualities of the heart, beautiful qualities like love, genuine love, compassion, joy, equanimity, generosity. If your life is really about cultivating these qualities of the heart and then spreading those qualities to everyone that you meet, to everybody that you engage with, then each part of your life would need to be an essential piece in that process of cultivating these qualities of the heart. And so what better arena or domain than partnership, which comes with so much heat, right? So much happening in the moment. If you can use that heat, if you can use the connection you have with this other person, and in particular, if you can use the inherent challenge of a relationship to grow your capacity for equanimity, for balance, for calm, for joy, for any of these things that we feel dedicated to, then your relationship becomes part of like a wider journey, becomes part of like a path. And that's what Devon and I have always been very, very interested in. And when we're teaching, this is what we're teaching other people to pay attention to.
The only path I can think of that's comparably steep is being a parent.
Another excellent example.
I actually can't think of anything more that requires more selflessness and more ability to put your own intense emotions to the side in moments of conflict than the parent-child relationship. I'm interested in the danger of spiritualizing emotions. That there can be a tendency, particularly for people on a spiritual path, to bypass, to leap into, well, we're all one anyway, so why deal with our conflict? Or this is all, it's all nothing really, and there's nobody here, so why should I worry about my rage and the fact that I want to run out the door? How do you teach around respecting and honoring emotion for what it is without spiritualizing it away or getting too transcendental?
Yeah. Well, first, I think this is a really common problem. Spiritualizing emotion, or you could call it spiritual bypassing, which is essentially a top-down kind of cognitive approach. You have an idea of what spirituality is. You have some kind of identity about who you are as a spiritual practitioner, and anything that's not lining up with the experience that you want to be having or the identity that you are attached to, you kind of push to the side. And what's fascinating about spiritual bypassing is that it is completely obvious to everyone around you, even when it is so nuanced and subtle for you in particular. So I think the first way to understand spiritual bypassing is to use others as a mirror. You need to actually, and the further you get on the spiritual path, the more subtle and nuanced these difficulties become, because the ego gets even more sophisticated, right? The ego, or these structures of consciousness. So really the only way to make progress with this kind of thing is to rely on other people telling you how you're doing. So you need spiritual friends, right? You need maybe to be relating to a spiritual teacher, or you need people in Buddhism, we call it Sangha, the beloved community, people who can show you where you're at. And in that realm, again, who better to mirror back your weirdest stuff than your beloved life partner who is there with you day in and day out, and is probably being driven half crazy by your bad habits, right? That is the person that can actually point to where you're stuck. I'll pass it to Devon for the second part.
I just love this question so much, Mark. I think a lot of what Nico and I have learned over the years is that we can be our best accountability partner. In fact, that's part of the deal. And that not only is it like calling each other out if we do feel this spiritual bypassing happening, but more like we can also really honor our emotions together. You know, we do a bunch of partner practices that we share in our new book around naming emotions, doing a kind of meditation, but in a witnessed, you know, as a couple, so that we have accompaniment through some of our more tangled, you know, the heart is like a labyrinth. We get so tangled in some of these most difficult emotions. And so to have these practices that are based in mindfulness, but are more about relational accompaniment, it's a really lovely space, different from therapy, but maybe also bringing a similar kind of quality of that kind of trusting relationship where you can be in your process, but also be witnessed in a way that you feel there's access to compassion in a different way. It's not so individualistic, which is another, I think, maybe misunderstanding or pitfall of mindfulness in the West, is that we've forgotten that it's a relational practice. And so some of these partner exercises we do is really, it's about naming our emotions, allowing them, learning from them in a way that actually centers them in our relationship, in our spiritual practice, rather than pushing them to the sides. Yeah.
Maybe I could give you just one example, since we're touching on this already. So in our book, we talk about checking in. And so Devon and I spent over 10 years in a relationship, primary partnership, before we ever found this practice that we call checking in. And I can tell you, those first maybe 12 years would have been so much smoother if we had found this practice earlier. It has been a total game changer for us. And it is the most simple thing in the world. Checking in, the way we describe it in the book, just means one person is the speaker and the other person is the listener. For about 5 minutes, the speaker speaks. And for about 5 minutes, the listener simply listens. So the listener can nod, they can give encouragers like, yeah, I hear you. But they're not speaking, they're not putting any of their information into the room. Their only job is to listen with a kind of warm awareness, the kind attention that we call mindfulness. Then after the speaker has spoken for about 5 minutes, you switch. The speaker becomes the listener becomes the speaker, and you do the same thing again. And so the next person gets to speak. And what we find over time is that we're able to, as the speaker, we're able to access parts of ourselves that are not so easy to access. Parts of ourselves that maybe we're not even accessing in the quiet of meditation. There's something about speaking and inquiring and being witnessed in the inquiry that is helping us to kind of wrap those emotions in awareness and to have them shared in a space that hopefully mostly feels pretty safe, pretty supportive. And so there's a whole process that's happening for the speaker And the kind of secondary gain is that the listener really gets to hear what is on their partner's mind, what is really in their heart. So Devon and I do this every day.
Really?
And sometimes we do this, like if we're on a long drive, we just drove from San Francisco to Madison, Wisconsin. If we're in the car for hours and hours at a time, we might do this 3 times in a day, right? Where we're really exploring something together. And the level of intimacy and the level of care and trust that builds through the most simple exercise in the world is kind of surprising. It's been so beneficial for us.
And it doesn't sound to me like a person needs to be a meditator to benefit from this kind of practice. You don't even have to be spiritual.
No, you don't have to be spiritual. You don't
So
have to be a
you
meditator,
just have to be able to keep your mouth shut,
which is not always easy.
not easy, and present, and to really attend to the other person.
Exactly.
That's really all it takes. This is very simple. So that goes to a question I was going to ask later, but I may as well ask it now. A lot of folks who are practitioners are involved with people who aren't. And that's a common rub along the spiritual path for a lot of people, is feeling like my partner doesn't care about waking up, or my partner isn't, consciously or deliberately committed to the path of awakening. How do we work with a partner who is a skeptic, or who isn't interested in this dimension of our lives, but whom we love and who has a good heart? It's a solid relationship, but you don't share that piece. Is that what advice would you give to folks like that?
This is such a great question. And because we have so many circles of friends and colleagues that are in different relationships, this is common. We see it a lot. So I would say don't necessarily have to share the same passion for awakening, but there are other things that should be in place in terms of shared values, for example, somewhat of a shared worldview. Those are all helpful. And these qualities that we're talking about in the book, such as deep listening, right? Or this checking in process, you can be coming at it from a very different way. But if you're both valuing the connection that it offers, then perhaps these are practices that both can engage in, maybe with different intentions. Mm-hmm. And then the other piece, I think of Joanna Macy, actually, she's been married for so long. She says, one of the most valuable ways that she has been able to stay with her partner is because she has this view of him as a wonder and as a mystery.
Yes.
And I think there's something healthy about that difference. The sense of we don't know this person so well. And there's a healthy distancing actually that can come from that uniqueness, even if we have different intentions or senses of the path of spirituality or awakening. So that's one thing. And then the last thing I want to say is that often in the book, we talk about the middle way, the Buddhist middle way, which is this sense of balance between self-indulgence, knowing what we need and knowing what we're about, and self-denial, right? Giving ourselves up for the other person's differences when knowing what they need. And our needs are going to be always different in conflict. So that's true about awakening and spirituality too. And if we can find this middle way of knowing what we need, honoring those in terms of our own needs, but also sacrificing some, moving towards the other person into their world, doing what interests them. There's a kind of balancing act. We call it walking the high wire, where I think it's a practice. This in itself is a practice of finding that middle ground.
Yeah. Can you say something more about healthy distance? What do you mean by that? I hope you're enjoying this conversation from the Seekers Forum. If you'd like to hear the rest of this interview and learn more about our robust collection of talks, videos, and guided writing sessions, please join us at theseekersforum.com and sign up for our free 30-day trial membership. I hope to see you there. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.